Okay, Kia, welcome to Bombay. And so we're going to, so your novel, for those of you who haven't read it, is published earlier this year or late last year. It's called The Castle Cross the Magnet Carta. It's a long novel, but, so I'm going to say a paradoxical thing. It's easy to read, but very hard to read. What I mean by that, the language is so strikingly simple. Sort of it sweeps you along the narrative. Very powerfully written, but very simply written. So it's not like a struggle. But it's also very hard to read emotionally because this is a story of race in America. And given the current situation, and he who shall not be named, this book is extremely relevant. Kia, tell us a little bit about the title of this. Do you want to start by explaining the title? Because it can be confusing. The Castle Cross the Magnet Carta. What does it mean? And why did you choose this title?
I wrote the entire novel before I had a title, and I kept, for a long time sort of going through images through the whole novel to come up with something. And somehow this came to me. Partly the castle image is from, so I should say there are 4 protagonists. There are 2 white brothers from the very deep South in the US. And I guess I'll talk a little bit, I'm not sure how much everyone knows about US history, but at the time of the climax of the novel, which is in 1960, was the beginning of these sort of a big push in the civil rights movement in the US, the rights for Black people in the US. And I should say, because race is, I think, defined very differently in India, even though I'm very light-skinned, I'm Black, I'm African American in the US, and it's not, there isn't a lot of colorism so much, so if you're Black, whether you're light or dark. So there are 2 brothers in the very deep South of Alabama, and then there are 2 brothers in the small town in Maryland, which is much where I grew up, which is technically in the South, but very much the North-South. The Deep South was very much known for very rabid, violent racism. That's not to say that it wasn't in the North as well. As a matter of fact, it's interesting because people could be kind of superior in the North, whites in the North, and in their judgment of the South. First act is in 1960 in the early civil rights movement. So it starts in their youth and ends in old age. And one of the Black brothers at one point has a dream. He's in this castle, which comes from, he and his friend, a white little boy, play in his backyard, and they make these towers out of junk. So it sort of comes from that. Magnet Carta is a play on the Magna Carta in the in European. It started in England, and it isn't, which has to do. I guess it's also here too, which is the idea that of justice and rights, so that it's not. It was, I think, in 1215 in England that no longer was it's just the whim of the king, but there's actually justice for human beings, was the idea that it became Magnet Carta because the little boy, one of the little Black boys, messes up the language and calls it that. And also, when that title came to me, it just felt right. It wasn't until later that I realized the reason that bastardization of the term felt right is because it is about warped justice.
Yeah, and the town in which, so these 2 Black brothers, the one who says Magnet Carta instead of Magna Carta, it's a fictional town in Maryland, but it's a fictional town based on the town that you grew up in and that your mother grew up in. Now, your mother grew up, a whole generation before you, of course. What kind of prejudice did she face? What kind did you face growing up in this town? Give us some anecdotes or incidents, if you can, to just give us a flavor of what it was like.
Okay, well, here's an example with my mother, because at that time it was Jim Crow still, which is American apartheid, was still going on. So, for example, her brother, who did look completely white, as a child would brag, one of her brothers would brag that he could swim in the white pool, not because he was light-skinned, because if they found out he was black, they would have thrown him out. So it was not legally, he wasn't supposed to, but he would taunt them because he passed. He passed would be the term. So that's just an example. In the book, I have an example of them going for ice cream, and as children, and there's several white tables to sit for ice cream that are white only, and then there's the black table, and they come to do ice cream, and the little boy doesn't understand why they can't go to one of the white tables since they're empty and the black table's not, and they don't say anything because it's so hard to explain, but to a child, a 6-year-old child, but that's an example of, it's American apartheid, basically. By the time I came around, that wasn't going on anymore, but I was often, because of growing in a small town that was mostly white and a very working class town, I was usually the only black kid in my class. And an example I say sometimes is that story I told you that I said, oh, you can cut it out because it was such a long thing. But one time I remember in high school, sitting around, it was phys ed class, and it was all these girls, there were about 15 of us, and we were sitting on the steps. We got into our gym clothes, and we were waiting for class to start for other people to come. And there were 2 girls standing, because they all had to get dressed, and one of them told a joke to the other, and she just started cracking up. And they were sort of staring at each other and smiling, and the one said, oh, we should tell everybody that joke. And the other one said, no, we can't tell that joke. And she said, oh, no, come on. And what happened was they wound up whispering it to each other, one by one, and every girl laughed, except they never came to me. And I knew it was a nigger joke, I know exactly. But at the time, I didn't have the guts to be able to call them on it, and maybe she would have enjoyed telling me it anyway, just to be cruel. So that's just an example.
And the news, you might want to tell them about the news.
Oh, yes. In my mother's generation, this was her uncle, so a generation before that. I can't remember what the job was. It was some working class job, and he was working with these white men. He was the only black man, and when he thought they were his friends. And then one day they gave him a present, maybe it was his birthday or something, and he opened it up and it was a noose, which of course is, I shouldn't say of course because I don't know how many people know it, but in the US this is the most violent form of the racism, which was lynching of black people just because they're black. And he went insane after that. I'm not sure, what else was going on in his life, but somehow that was, the straw that broke the camel's back. And
okay, yeah, I think you've included it in the novel. Have you included that incident in the novel? No.
It's in there in a very different context.
Yeah, in a different context.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned, yeah.
So, Kia, you've written a number of plays, I think at least 15 plays. And you've
that have been produced, and I've written others.
Produced, okay, established playwright. Then why did you suddenly decide to write a novel, and then your first novel, 800 pages?
Well, that's exactly why, because I think it would be a long play. So, but I definitely have a dramatist spirit. So, if someone offered to turn it into a miniseries, or someone offered to turn it into a play that was, 2 nights or 3 nights, I would adapt it in a second. But that was really when the story came to me. I didn't know it was going to be 800 pages, but I knew it was going to be longer than a novel.
And was there pressure from your publisher I'm talking about publishing today, they want it smaller. Did they put pressure on you to cut the size or to change the title? Did they ask you to make the title Make America Great Again?
This is one of the wonderful things about being at a small press, and this particular one, who are very much about social justice. So it was a perfect mix. Actually, if I didn't know before that we were so perfect for each other. The day I walked in last spring wearing my Bernie Sanders shirt and found out everybody and the whole, starting with the publisher, he just like was thrilled when he saw that shirt, and everybody who works there, not because they were required to be for Bernie Sanders, because they're all progressive. A whole other story of that I'm not going to get into right now, but of how if the elections were not skewed in the US, Bernie Sanders absolutely would have been the president, because most of the electorate, he was the popular person, but there was manipulations.
We'll come to the elections, I promise you. But to go back...
I let it go. I didn't go on into it.
So the background to this joke is that I emailed Kia for a newspaper interview. And the last question, I mean, I think I had 800 words. The whole interview should have been 800 words long. And my last question was, tell us your views about the election. And I got 4,000 words. I promise you.
You didn't tell me there was a word limit.
And then Kia writes me another email saying, I think that answer might have been a little long. You can cut out the last para or one para. So I was like, okay, we'll discuss it at the...
What was funny, there were like 6 questions, and the other ones were about my novel, and I was definitely expressive, but when she asked me about the election...
She just went crazy, yeah. But in the novel, so there are these 2 white brothers growing up in the South. There's one boy called Randall, and his brother is BJ. BJ is the elder boy, and he's deaf. And Randall is the younger brother who's very bright and good at school. And one day he realizes that his elder brother, nobody's bothered to teach him, he can't even read, he's isolated in his world, and he begins to sort of teach him sign language. And a whole section of this book is devoted to sign language. Kia, tell us how you developed this deaf character, how you learned sign language, and can you talk about that a bit?
Well, when I was a kid, my mom had 7 siblings. And her sister that she was closest to, she was also her best friend, their kids, who were my generation, one of them was deaf. And so I think he was always such a part of my formative years that I think that's what influenced this character. But we completely separated as adults, so a lot of that, his youth is from my cousin, but the adulthood is from my imagination. Although I was thrilled that I really wanted a deaf person to read the book, and by contacts I was able to find the loveliest person, because believe it or not, this book was 20% longer in an earlier draft. And she didn't know me at all and read the book. We still haven't met each other, but we've become friends through, she lives in Florida, but we've become great friends through email, and we were all about Bernie, she and I as well. And so her mother read the book also and said that she loved BJ, it was her favorite character, and her mother said it reminded her of many deaf men she knew. So I appreciated that, because that was fiction. And I've taken sign language classes, and the teachers were deaf, so I've met deaf people, but after my cousin, I wasn't really close to a deaf person. So I was really happy for that.
So was it very hard you went for your sign language course recently, and was it very hard to learn, or did you pick it up easily? Yes?
Well, I sometimes have trouble with languages anyway. I'm very good with sort of communicating what I want to say, but less good at receiving, and this in verbal languages as well, and sort of the same thing happened with sign language. So I could do it okay. But the main thing is that, you can say anything in sign language that you can say in regular language. So the whole section is just, even though you know it's in sign language, I write it in just regular English. There's just a couple of moments when I write in sign syntax, because it's so different than English syntax that it would be, I couldn't possibly have written the whole thing that way.
Yeah. And so Randall teaches BJ sign language, and he goes out of his way to teach his brother. So he's a good kid. Mm-hmm. When he's growing up, he's a good kid. And then one day, when I think he's 11 or 12, his father takes him for like what's an initiation ceremony. Will you tell them about it?
Yeah, I guess I'll say that.
That proves to be a sort of a very important point in his life.
Yes. So he's 13 at the beginning, a very good student, close to his mother, but a little more distant from his father, who works at a sawmill. And then one night, his father wakes him up in the middle of the night and takes him in the darkness. This is kind of a bonding moment because he just wasn't so close to his father. And it's a Ku Klux Klan cross burner. And so, and he, as a kid, he grows up with, there's the junior Klan where that other kids are in. So this is all a part of Deep South life. So at that time, he's neither so much shocked nor, impressed to see the burning cross, but not making any decisions of whether this is right or wrong, but being neutral and trying to make a decision of whether this might be a part of his life at some point. But about that moment, it is a bonding moment with his father. So,
Yeah, and so it begins. The novel begins with America entering the Second World War, and at that time, the Americans are fighting for democracy. The military is segregated, and the blacks and white soldiers are treated differently. They're even paid differently. Black soldiers are paid poorer wage. And the novel ends in 2010. It's a wide 70-year arc. And it ends with the commander-in-chief of the US Army as a black man, President Obama. Where were you when Obama was elected? What did you feel? Was it a deeply emotional moment? Because, the US Embassy in Bombay, they have an election breakfast and they invited a few journalists as the votes came in. And when Obama was voted, it was clear that it was called for him. I promise you, not one eye was dry. Every American present was crying that day. It was such a deeply emotional moment. What was it like for you?
I didn't cry, but there was something. There were two huge things that happened. First, it was the first African-American president, the first person of color as the United States, as the president of the United States. And traditionally, black people are on the lowest rung in terms of racism. So there was that going on at the same time as after 8 years of George Bush that everyone was so sick of. So I think it was this huge emotional thing. I won't say that I cried, but I was uplifted and had pride as a black American. I did not, was not thinking was not immediately think this would be a great president, but I thought he certainly is going to be better than Bush. He was an intelligent black man. He knew the issues. I thought there may be some hope here. I'll tell you, the very first day in office, when he said he was going to close Guantanamo, that's when I thought he'd be a great president. 8 years later. So, very mixed reviews.
Yeah, what is your assessment of his presidency 8 years on?
Well, I feel that he lame duck the last 2 years. There were interesting things with Iran, with Cuba, but I felt that, I want to be fair, there was very much in the government, the Republicans that were, everything he did were against. So I do not want to downplay that. That was definitely difficult. But I also feel there are things he could have done as executive order, including closing Guantanamo. I felt there was a lot of just catering to the Republicans, trying to sort of bring some sort of solidarity, and it was not going to happen. And so I feel ultimately he was a political person, so it became about getting reelected and not pushing things so much. In my opinion, speaking of politics, I think that's Hillary Clinton, I think the Democratic Party felt it's her turn, and they were going to do everything that it's time for. I mean, I would say, sure, it's time for a woman, but ultimately, I most cared about the politics, and hers were just much more conservative than Bernie Sanders, who was much more progressive. And so, so I just feel ultimately that they're late in the game. There were some things that I really appreciated that he did, and it caught me by surprise because after the first 6 years, I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah, his
because,
second term was much more progressive and on many fronts. Of course, you don't mention him by name in the novel. You just say.
I did it on
You don't
purpose,
ever
yes.
mention him by name. I looked, but and yours
As
is a
a-
historic novel and it's a historic presidency. Why did you choose not to mention the name?
Because I was feeling disappointed. And I
Okay,
didn't,
it's okay.
quite
Fair
frankly.
enough.
I mean, I make a reference to a black president. And I actually did want to name some sort of prominent black person. And I was trying to think of who that would be and how to fit in organically to the story. I actually mentioned the TV personality Tavis Smiley at one point because he actually does much activist work for actually not just black people, but the poor in general. He's very much, and he grew up poor himself.
Well, again, the Obama presidency, the race situation in America has just escalated, largely because of this range of police shooting against unarmed black men. Can you talk a little bit about that, about this whole movement, the pushback and
I forgot to bring my shirt.
your
I was going to
T-shirt?
bring my Black Lives Matter shirt,
Oh,
and
but,
I forgot.
but talk about Black Lives
But
Matter.
I have a
I'm
big
sure
Black
people.
Lives Matter shirt. Well, one thing about that whole movement is now it's gotten a lot more press, but it has been going on forever. It's just that thanks to 3 young activist women, they're the ones who started the Black Lives Movement. 2, I think, are gay, but it was 3 women, young women. And suddenly it's become, and I think despite the fact that there are so many, the difference is between now and all the decades that this has been going on is that cameras, everybody can now film them. And so it was always the police word against the citizens, and the police were always given the benefit of the doubt in courts. I did a play on police brutality that's been actually, it was 16 years ago, but suddenly it's been getting a lot of productions again. And in what I had interviewed some cops on this issue, judges know they're lying and sometimes cannot stand it, but they're supposed to believe, or to some degree they have to, there's pressure to support the police or to lean more toward the police. So now, though, I do think there are changes, even though it feels very frustrating because all these incidents keep happening. Even in New York, I definitely feel a new respect from police to citizens just in general. Somebody said something interesting recently that there's a saying, and they say it a lot in supporting the police. Well, it's just a couple of bad apples, which is probably true. I think that is true. I think it depends on the police force, but I think in many police forces, there were only a few bad cops. But a speaker I heard recently said, but the problem is they don't say the rest of the saying, a few bad apples spoils the whole bunch. And so if there's only a couple of police killing black people because we're black, then that's too many. So, but I do think that there's more of a consciousness now. So I think things are getting better because the pressure stays on.
About police violence and blacks, the one brother in the novel, Elliot, he becomes a civil rights lawyer. Now I want to ask you about To Kill a Mockingbird and the sequel. So To Kill a Mockingbird, everyone's familiar with. But in her next novel, Go Set a Watchman, Atticus Finch doesn't come out very well. Have you read it?
Yeah,
No.
I haven't read it. I'll tell you. You can finish your question. I'll tell you why I haven't.
So Atticus Finch is this great hero in Mockingbird, and when he defends the black man who's wrongly accused of rape, and then they all stand when he walks out, and he's like this big hero. But in the next novel, he's a segregationist. He doesn't want black and white children to go to school together, and his daughter Scout is absolutely horrified. And he says, these sort of the black lawyers are here like vultures to protect their own. What did you think of To Kill a Mockingbird, and what do you think of?
Well, the reason I didn't read that other novel is because, which was written so long ago and was finally brought out, is because from everything I heard, she never wanted that published. And the publisher wanted to make money. And so I actually didn't read it because I heard that it would completely change your mind, or could change your mind about To Kill a Mockingbird, or her point of view about it. And I feel, which is actually very true in my novel, I very much believe that human beings can change and be better people. And so if she wrote that, it sounds like she was not a good person then. But if she didn't want it published, it sounds like she changed as a human being. And I felt to respect that change, that's why I didn't read it.
So you want to hold on to the old Atticus from Mockingbird?
Well, no, I guess I'm not even talking about the character. I'm talking about
Harper Lee.
The writer, that she as a person, yes, I'm glad you clarified that. I meant that she as a person, because, she was from the Deep South. I would not be surprised at all if she's a cracker, which is a word we use for a racist. But To Kill a Mockingbird was the book that everybody read, the book that she obviously felt her heart was in. And I didn't want to go to this place of when she was a lesser person, since she obviously had changed.
Okay.
Do you want to read?
Yes. I was going to say, can you read a little bit from the novel so that they get a taste of some of the pages at least?
Do you want to do it now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I'm just going to read a little piece from the middle of the novel. And this is Elliot, who is the little black boy, and now he's a young man, and he's a lawyer. And this takes place in 1960. It's Georgia, which is the Deep South. And I would try to read it very clearly so that you can understand. I've never read it and held a microphone before. The room is small, cramped, and uncomfortably warm, with no windows or fan. A rectangular wooden table and chairs. They are adult chairs, yet the 4 grown-ups stand while only the 2 little Negro boys are seated, their legs dangling. They work in coloring books. When the lawyer walks in, all eyes turn to him. The older child sits on the opposite side of the table, facing the door, which the guard now closes as he exits. The younger's back is to the door, so he has to turn around to see the visitor. He is the first person in the room to speak. "Are you Mr. Campbell?" "Yes," says Elliot, who takes off his hat and holds it in his hands. "I am." The boy scrambles out of his chair to stand and shake his attorney's hand with the formality of the gentry. "How do you do?" The adults are Claudette and Ronald Price, the parents of 7-year-old Jordan, and Howard and Minnie Williams, the parents of 9-year-old Max. They introduce themselves to Elliot. "Where's Dee Dee?" Mrs. Price asks. Elliot is confused. "Miss Wilcox." She must have gotten held up. Jordan's mother seems stricken, as if this is yet another bad omen. "This is a fire truck, Mr. Campbell," says Jordan. "Fire truck, I color it red." He makes a siren sound, moving his picture through the air. "Can I wear your hat?" Max asks, and Elliot gives it to him. Max pats it on, and it falls over his eyes. He giggles, then pushes it back on his head so he can see before resuming his coloring. "This is a Dalmatian," says Jordan. "The page is white, but white crayon make Dalmatian whiter. This is the fireman. Max make him pink, but I just leave him be. Like the page white, but not white like the Dalmatian. I traced it, see? I traced it. Looked like the real picture. See?" "I see. What did you color, Max?" Elliot takes a chair, sitting on an end of the table between the boys. "Train." Max had done a very studied rendering of an engineer standing outside a passenger car, kindly talking to a porter. Both men are pink. "That's very nice, Max. But you could have made those men brown." Both boys stop coloring to look up and gape at Elliot. "My father was a porter, like him. And colored men can be engineers and firemen too." The children look down at their pictures, then back up at Elliot, blinking. Elliot asks gently, "You boys want to tell me what happened?" Max sighs, tired of the question, but Jordan jumps in, seeming to delight in this reversal of children should be seen and not heard. Whenever he tells this story, he has all the adults' undivided attention. "We was playing with Jenny Dodgson and Lacey Pike, and Jenny Dodgson's daddy's a fireman, and he the mailman too, and I don't know what Lacey's daddy do." And Jenny go, "How old is you?" And I say 7, and she say, "I'm 7 too." And Max go, "I'm 9, and Lacey say, "I'm 8, and Jenny go, "You want to play dolls?" And I say, "Dolls is for girls." And she say, "You want to play hide and go seek?" And I say, "Okay, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. And we find her and Lucy in Miss Della Rose's bushes, and Jenny go, "You want to touch my hair?" And I say, "Okay, her hair straight and yellow." And Lacey go, "You want to touch my hair? It red." And I say, "Okay." And Jenny go, "I seen Bieber and Sissy Gompers kissing." Bieber, Jenny's big brother. And Jenny go, "You want to kiss me?" And she stick her lips out, and I go, "Okay." And I kiss her right on the lips. Back. And she laugh, and Lacey go to Max, and Lacey say, "I know how to kiss." And Max say, "Okay." And Lacey go to Max, peck, and we find a frog. We pick up that frog, but it slip away, hop, hop. And we go home for supper, and we knock on the door, and Mama get the door. Then she go, "Jordan, Ron," and me and Daddy come running to the door. Her voice sound like we ought to come running to the door, and a police standing there. Policemen say, "You kiss a white girl, boy." Policemen look mad. Policemen say, "Ginny, tell her daddy we was kissing." Policemen say, "You know that's a white girl. You know that's a white girl." And policeman got a gun in his pocket. He keep tapping it, and they put the handcuffs on me, click, and they put me in the paddy wagon, and Mama crying and me crying, and then they drive, and then they park. They park a long time, and then come Max in the handcuffs crying. They put him in the paddy wagon with me, his Mama crying, and in the jail they punch us in the tummy. They punch us in the legs, in the back a long time. Bang, bang, bang. My tummy hurt, and every day we say, "Can we see our Mama?" And they say, "Should have thought of that when you go raping little white girls." And then our Mama and Daddy come, and then the judge say the reformatory. So they send us here, the reformatory, and they make us pick the strawberries in the sun hot, and they make us talk to the psychologist, and the psychologists say, "You ought to be castrated." And the psychologists say, "You know what castrated mean?" And we say no, and the psychologists tell us, Jordan's eyes are filled, his demeanor completely changed, as if at the beginning of his narrative, his enthusiasm in having a new adult as a captive audience had caused him to temporarily forget his story's terrifying end. Elliot turns to the other child and speaks softly. Now you tell me, Max. Like you say, Max had continued to color throughout Jordan's testimony and doesn't look up from his task now. Elliot talks to the parents quietly a few minutes. They are interrupted by a quick knock, followed by the guard poking his head in. 2 minutes. He shuts the door. Mrs. Price wipes her eyes. Come give Mama a kiss goodbye. No! Jordan runs to his mother, throwing his arms around her legs. I want to go home! She reaches down, embracing him. That's why we're going to talk with Mr. Campbell now, baby. That's what we're trying to find out. You be a good boy, all right? Mrs. Williams instructs. And she and her husband walk over to kiss Max, who never looks up, never stops coloring. May I have my hat back, Max? Max stands, takes it off, and hands it to Elliot. Then he stares up at his lawyer. Can I ask you a question? Of course. Elliot stoops next to the child, and Max cups his hand around his own mouth and Elliot's ear. When my mama kissed me, that don't count as rape. Do it? It only rape when I kiss back, right?
Very beautifully read. This playwright in you surfaced and was it's a heartbreaking story. And
it's actually,
tell
that's
us
inspired by a true story.
yeah, tell us, and it must have happened so many times, different versions of this. The whole criminalization of the black man. Tell us about that and why you wrote this in.
Yes, even as children, because they kiss these little girls to them, little black boys kissing little white girls, that they felt white society at that time, that it was the, juvenile equivalence of rape. I read an article after I'd written this about one of these little boys grown up, who's now like 60 or something, or maybe a little older, and I guess his 60s, and it was really interesting because actually there were other things I found out that later became in the book, that there were crosses burned in their yard, which is the sign of the Ku Klux Klan, of the family's yard after the children had been taken into custody. One of them, the little boy's older sister, would sweep bullets off their porch every day. But the interesting thing about this man was that was interviewed now, he kept saying, and this was 2011, he kept saying, I didn't kiss that little girl, she kissed me. Which was really interesting that in 2011, he was still afraid to even imply that he might have kissed her, first or returned the kiss. So,
any questions? Wait for the mic, or you can, yeah.
It's quite similar to what has been happening with the Dalit experience in India. And you know something about it because you've been writing, you've been covering it. Are there lessons that we can learn, and maybe, from these movements and where they've gone, and even just now with the elections, the fact that the affirmative action has allowed the black community to progress so much. And similarly in India, there's a similar kind of a resistance, not even people who don't like the fact that the Dalit community has progressed so much more than the mainstream. Hindu or other communities. So it's quite similar, isn't it?
There's very strong parallels between the caste system in India and race in America. And in fact, about 5 years ago, there was a writer called Isabel Wilkerson who wrote The Warmth of Other Suns. It was a non-fiction book, and she's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, about how there was a great migration of African Americans from the South to the North, because the North was considered little more progressive than the South. Relatively speaking, much more progressive. And through that book, it's a thick book, it got one of the best books of the year award. Not once in that whole book did she use the word racism. Not once. What did she use instead? Casteism. Through the whole thing, she described the whole black and white race relation as a caste system. And she clearly drew that parallel between India's caste and the way we treat Dalits here and the way blacks are treated in America. And then there's the famous Black Panther movement of the 60s, was it? In the 60s?
Yes, it is.
The Black Panther movement inspired a similar movement in Bombay. It was called the Dalits, a group of writers started by a famous poet. And
It was late 60s, early 70s.
exactly,
The Panthers.
some as civil rights, post-civil rights, civil rights time.
They were inspired by Malcolm X, actually.
They were
Panthers.
inspired by?
By Malcolm
By
X. They
Malcolm
were
X,
inspired by
yes,
him.
Malcolm
yes.
X. So Dalit Panthers were inspired by the Black Panthers. So yes, it's a very close parallel, I agree with you. There is one question there.
I'm glad someone brought up this, because this came to me as she was reading it. Two things I just want to mention in brief. When you talk about the justice system and the courts favoring the police because they are in authorities, it's across the board. And you see this in the football coaches, what is coming out now in America. You see it in the school system with the authorities. It's same in India. The reformatories, the police, it's exactly the same. It's more a question of authority. What is that phrase? Power corrupts.
Yes, yes, I
Thank
agree.
you.
That.
Yes.
And I'm glad that she mentioned this about the Dalits, because it has been going on for a long time. And no one has written it so strongly today, even though it has been happening for far longer than it has happened in America.
Thank you. Anything you'd like to add, or should we close?
What'd you say?
You want to add anything? Or
No, but when you were saying about authority, I mean, that is an interesting thing with the police, because they are a working class organization, but it empowers them with this authority, and they're, and back to class, ostensibly protecting citizens, but they're really protecting, in many ways, as I say, it's changing, but a certain class, and so, of which black people are usually not a part. And so, and it also becomes about, in terms of capitalism, protecting property over human beings. And
True. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry.
The class dimension, I think, is extremely important, because I remember when Obama was elected. I was in Berkeley at the time, and of course the whites in Berkeley, being a liberal community, were elated. But among the blacks, there was a question mark. And one question that came up, by the way, there are very few blacks in Berkeley these days. I mean, considering that Berkeley was one of the seats of civil rights, etc. Now there are very few blacks, especially among the students. Probably 1%, if that. But nevertheless, blacks coming from outside, the debate was, well, isn't he one of them?
is
For Obama.
is one of
One of them, meaning a white kid. for Obama
Oh.
among the blacks.
Oh, in terms of class?
Yeah.
You know, to be honest, Rory, I'm not sure. I know his, I mean, he definitely went, you know, Harvard and all that stuff, so he definitely went to those schools. I never, you know, a lot of people read his, you know, about his father and all that, who was, who's Kenyan. I actually don't know his background. I presumed it was not working class, but I honestly don't know.
Well, I mean, what came up at that time in terms of the background, he went to this very fancy school.
Yes, absolutely.
In
terms
Hawaii,
of that.
and to this day, that school is the elite school.
Elite-
etc.
elite.
So I mean, but
Oh, as you mean before he went to university
Yeah,
and all that.
before
Okay, I didn't know that. So
yeah, and I think the debate among the blacks were very conscious of the fact that he was not one of them in the sense he didn't come of the ghetto.
Yeah.
He wasn't one of them in that
Exactly,
sense. They always
he
thought
was
of
them.
him.
And Harvard, of course, plays into that.
Well, you know, I mean, I think it's, but it is race as well as class. Class is so important, but if Obama weren't Obama, or he weren't president, he weren't, you know, the Obama that we think of, and if he were driving a black man in a white neighborhood at a certain time and no one knew who he was, the police, yes, they could, yeah. So, just despite his class. As a matter of fact, sometimes because of, say, he were driving in an expensive car, they would presume, oh, he must be a drug dealer because he's black or something.
Yeah, he talked about it. He said, you know, when I've heard walking down, I've heard car doors lock. Because I'm a black man, before he became president, walking down, I say, I hear car doors lock. I see women clutch their bags a little tighter when I'm in the elevator with them. This is this is after Trayvon Martin was killed. It was a very sort of personal speech that he gave. So, yeah.
Actually, a friend of mine, we're talking about gentrification in Harlem, where I live, as well as, you know, other places. And he talked about as the gentrification, this was years ago, was really starting to kick off. He's lived at different places, but he was in Harlem at that time, a black man, a friend of mine. And he was standing at the bus stop, and there was a new resident, a white woman, who sort of clutched her purse. And that was so painful because he said, I'm in Harlem, I'm home, I should not have to deal with that stuff. So, and by the way, he's, I mean, very working, I shouldn't say, you know, it depends on how you define that, working class in terms of his income, but very educated. Yeah, that was all about race. So.
Okay, okay, one more.
I had a question on reverse racism, actually. So what
Reverse racism.
About what?
Reverse racism.
Oh,
So in this context, I mean, I can give you a little bit of background, but the question is basically when, for example, Indians or non-white people
Hold it closer.
look at those who are white and would like to give them preference for various things. So from my background, I'm a dual qualified barrister in India and England. And in England, I've never faced racism at all, despite the fact that the commercial bar in England is not, I mean, it's a pretty white bar and a white male culture. Never faced racism. But in India, you know, when one goes to conferences and speaks to delegates and so on, oh, the conference is really good because there were a lot of Goras, which are white people. So there's a lot of reverse racism embedded in our culture. It might be because of our colonial descent, but I mean, it is 70 years on. So what do you think a society can do to sensitize this issue?
I mean, I can only speak of the US, and we are a racist country, so we are all racist, actually, whatever our race, and we all have our stereotypes. You know, it's interesting, there was a I never did this because I was too afraid to do it because I didn't want to flunk the test as everyone does. But there was this test apparently on the internet years ago. It was very much about US racism. And there would be, apparently they would flash pictures like, you know, a black man, a white man, and this, and who's the drug dealer, who's the businessman, and they would be basically dressed the same, but the difference would be the race. Or maybe they would be dressed differently, but it was basically the difference was the race. And but the results of this, and you couldn't cheat because apparently if you hesitated to think of the right answer, it clocked that, right? So, but the interesting thing was, no matter what your race in that test, which has to do with psychologically, the white race came on top, the black, even if you were a black person taking that test, even if you were an Asian person. And so it's a certain racism that's instilled in all of us, a psychological racism of, you know, who is the person that's the legitimate person here. And as a result of that, there's definitely, if you think, as again, I can only think of in the US, but an organization like say the Panthers, which actually weren't anti-white because they had, a lot of people don't know this, but at that time there were so many 60s organizations, they had connections with other white groups, but they wouldn't be members of the Panthers, but other white radical groups. But yeah, I mean, I think there are those responses. I don't know what the answer is, but talking about, say, this police issue, I think things are getting better. I think it is about understanding and open-mindedness, I think, is really important in hearing people and not just making assumptions because of your own presumptions, I guess.
Thanks a lot.
We're probably over.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we're out of time now. Thanks.